Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. The website is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll soon be adding a section on JavaScript, so I hope you visit us at www.ontargethtml5.com.
Welcome to the CSS Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your instructor, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about the syntax of CSS. Understanding the syntax of CSS. The syntax of CSS, cascading style sheets, is relatively simple. Most of it's common sense and it's relatively easy to learn. That's not to say that you're expected to memorize all the many properties of the language. Even after all these years, I still refer back to the manuals occasionally as I'm styling different types of documents. But CSS is a style sheet language, and it really is not that hard for you to become very proficient at it. A style sheet language is used for describing the look and formatting of a document written in markup language. If you've gone through the HTML tutorials, you'll hear me refer to HTML as markup language constantly throughout those tutorials. And that's what it is. Hypertext markup language is a markup language. CSS is written specifically to style markup languages. While most often used to style web pages and interfaces written in HTML, XHTML, and now HTML5, that language can be applied to any XML document also. So CSS not only can style all of our HTML, XHTML, or HTML5 documents, but it's actually written to style different types of markup languages to include XML. As we get further along in the tutorial series, you'll actually see some of that, how CSS is used to mark up other types of markup languages. In future tutorials, we'll actually learn about some of these other uses of the CSS styling language. So let's look at a sample formatting rule in CSS. A rule is made up of two parts. We have the selector. The selector tells the browser which element or elements that our style pertains to. And then we actually have the declaration. The declaration sets the style properties of the selector that have been designated. We can also have a combination selector. A combination selector consists of more than one particular element. You can group selectors together in order to have more efficient CSS code. So in other words, in this particular example, I'm looking at an ordered list, a paragraph, and a list element. And I'm formatting those three, or styling those three elements with the same styles. You can also target more specific elements by using white space to designate a specific element, for instance, an element inside of a div, or an element inside of a list. And we'll go through that as we go through the tutorial series. In the example that you're looking at here, I'm actually targeting all the list elements that reside inside of a div tag, and I'm setting their font size to 12 pixels. Because of the way I've set up that selector with my div, my white space, my space, and then my list element, I'm saying I want you to target all the list elements that reside inside of a div tag. Understanding the syntax of CSS means learning the selectors and how to properly target elements on the web page. That's probably the most important aspect of learning CSS, is learning how to properly target those elements on our web pages. And that's what we're going to practice over the course of these tutorials. We're going to practice many different ways to target specific elements on a web page. We'll get plenty of practice doing all these throughout these tutorial series, so don't get frustrated, because we will be going through a lot of different ways to do the same thing in CSS, so you can learn the different aspects of styling your web pages. Let's look at a sample formatting rule inside of CSS. A CSS rule is made up of two parts. We talked about the selector and declaration in an earlier slide. Now let's talk about the actual declaration itself. The declaration, which is enclosed in the curly braces, gives the instructions on how to format the style. In this example, we have three rules that we're applying to H1 tags. We have a font size rule, we have a color, and we have a border. The styling rules themselves are made up of two specific parts. We have the properties, which you see highlighted in green, and then we have the values, which you see highlighted in blue. The properties are separated by colons, and when we end a statement, we end it with a semicolon. Very important syntax we have to follow. So we have the property, which for instance in this case is font size, with our colon, and then we say the font size, the actual value of the font size is 12 pixels. Many different ways that we can do sizing and measurements in CSS, and you'll learn those as we go through these tutorials also. But keep in mind that the declaration itself has two different parts, the properties and the values. There are many different ways to write CSS rules, and we'll cover many of those techniques as we go through the training in the tutorial series. So let's go into our development environment and let's look at some of the things that we've discussed and practice some of the principles that we've just talked about in the slide presentation. Alright, as I do in all my tutorials, I first want to go in and confirm that my development environment is up. So let's go ahead and drop out of our presentation. I want you to make sure that you have your Apache web server up and running. PHP and MySQL is also running. We're not going to be using it in this particular tutorial, but it's a good practice to get in to make sure that web server is up and running as it should be. Next thing I want to do is let's go in and look at the root structure that I built in the root of our web server for this particular tutorial. I've got the CSS_syntax.01 HTML file, which we're going to use as the basic HTML file for our particular tutorial. I also have my _CSS directory. In that directory, we have the base.css file, which we created in the first tutorial in this series, which, if you remember, was the CSS Styling tutorial. We actually created that base.css file, so go ahead and make sure that you've got that in your CSS folder because we'll be using that. That's got our CSS Reset in it. Alright, so you know what the directory structure should look like in your web root. We want to make certain that we've got our browser window up and over to the web root that we're going to be using for this tutorial. And let's load our text editor so that we can begin doing our demonstration. We want to go ahead and start with a new file. Alright, so if you have access to the exercise files, you can go ahead and let's load our basic HTML file. I'm going to go ahead and copy this out of the exercise files. It's included with the exercise files. If you don't have that, I'll make certain that you've got time to pause the video and type that in. I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my text editor. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I actually want to save this inside the root of my web root, and I'm just going to save this CSS_syntax_01.html. So I'm going to go ahead and save that in my root file, in the root directory. Let's go ahead and let me make sure that my word wrap is turned on. It is, that's good. Let me expand this window a little bit so it's a little bit easier for y'all to type. And now would be a great time if you need to pause the video to type this file in. Alright, let me scroll down a little bit. And okay, now another time for you to pause the video and type this in if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little more. And now would be a great time to pause the video if you need to get the remainder of this file. Alright, let me go ahead and put this back. Reset it back the way it was. We've got it saved. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and discuss this. This is the basic template that we've been working with since we actually started this tutorial series. And it's probably going to be the one that we're going to work with for quite a bit of this tutorial series as we work through the different styling aspects of CSS. I'll probably add a little bit to it as we move on, but just so that you have a good file to work with as we go through the tutorial series. The next thing I want to do is I want to go into our CSS directory. Let's go ahead and open that base.css file so that you can see what we've got there. If you remember right from the first tutorial in this series where we set up CSS Styling, we built our CSS Reset, and that's what we're starting with in this file. I'm going to go ahead and make sure my word wrap is turned on. Now would be a good time to pause if you need to type this in if you don't have this from the first tutorial. This is part of the CSS Styling tutorial, which is the first tutorial in the CSS series. Let me go ahead and scroll down. Okay, you can pause if you need to pause, so you can type this in. And I'm going to scroll down a little further so you can get the rest of the file. And another good opportunity for you to pause and type this in. This file should be saved in your _CSS directory. This is the file we're actually going to make our changes to as we start working with our files. So now we've got all the files set up and we're ready to go to start playing with our formatting using what we've learned in the CSS syntax. Alright, so let's go ahead and load up our file. I know you're not imagining things. You actually I did have two files in here when I paused that tutorial to move on to the next section. I just went ahead and deleted that second file so you didn't get confused. It was actually a CSS _syntax _01 Not quite certain why I did that. Sometimes I just kind of lose my mind too. So I went in and deleted it while we were on that pause. I'm going to go ahead and load up the file that we've just saved to give us an idea where we're at with the styling of this particular document. And if you remember from the CSS Styling tutorial, this is where we left off. We had put in all the defaults for our CSS Reset. We had taken out all those default settings from that browser, and we're starting out just like this. Now we're looking at our document. This is the actual HTML document that we're seeing here, and this is our actual styling page. Don't forget, we're calling this CSS worksheet right up here inside of our HTML file with this link. We're calling in that base.css file version 1 to style the document as we make these changes. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and format the background color of our sample web page. So I'm going to go in that base.css file. I'm going to make sure I'm below my CSS Reset because I don't want to do anything to modify my reset yet. And because what I want to do is I want to format, or I want to style the entire browser display window, I'm actually going to target the HTML element. And if you remember back when we were talking about this, the HTML element, if you've taken the HTML tutorial topics, is the root element of our web page. So that's going to style the entire background of the browser window. So I'm going to go back in that CSS. I'm going to type my HTML element ID. I'm going to put my opening and closing curly braces. And right here I'm just going to type background. And by the way, this is one of the advantages of having a good text editor. You notice how it finishes? It's pulling up the available commands for me in CSS because it knows I've got a CSS file by my extension. So it looks as I start to type and completes what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that enter key and take the background because that's what I'm trying to style. I'm going to put my pound symbol, CCC, and I'm going to end it with a semicolon. This is one way that we can enter colors in CSS. You're going to see me enter colors a lot of different ways as we go through these tutorials, and we're actually going to have a tutorial topic will be on colors, not the different ways to enter them. But for right now, let's just go ahead and save these changes. And I want you to refresh your browser window, and you'll notice that we've got a light gray now that's taken up the entire root element of our HTML document. So based on what we learned in the slide presentation, remember now we've got our declaration. We have our selector, which is the HTML element, the declaration, which is the actual styling that we're doing to the page, and we've broken that down into properties and values, the property being background, the value being $CCC, which is a light gray on our color chart. So now we've actually formatted the root element of our HTML document. The next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and do some formatting in the body element. One of the things I tend to do as I'm setting up my CSS pages is I tend to follow the normal document flow of the HTML document. And again, if you've gone through the HTML tutorials, you've heard me talk about normal document flow. But if you'll look at my HTML element inside of my HTML page, the next item that I would come up with, remember, head elements are not displayed in the browser window. These belong to the HTML document, but they're part of the head portion of the document. They don't actually display in the browser window. This is where we have our meta tags and our links and our scripts and all kinds of cool stuff goes in the head, but nothing that's displayed here other than the title, which is up here at the top of the browser. So the next element that I can style is my body element. So I'm going to go back to my base, and again, following my normal document flow, I'm going to type in my body element, my opening and closing curly braces, and I'm going to type in a few. I'm just going to grab these from my exercise file that's part of the exercise folder if you've downloaded. If not, I'll give you a chance where you can pause and type this in. This is all part of, by the way, example number 3 inside the exercise folder. Now would be a great time for you to pause and type this in if you need to do that. What we're doing with this body element is I'm styling the background, very similar to the way I did the HTML element. I'm giving it a width of 80%, and what's really cool, by using this margin left auto and margin right auto, it's going to allow that body element to stay centered inside of my HTML element. So whatever size my body window is, the width is going to be 80% of that for the body. It's going to give it a new background color of white, and it's going to keep it centered based on that margin left and margin right auto. So if I save those changes, and actually I'm going to do a save as here because I want to save this as base_01. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go to CSS file, and I'm going to make sure I change it here to base_1, or else we're not going to read those changes. And I want to do a save as here also. I want to save this as syntax_02. So I'm not overwriting everything that we're doing. So if you do have the exercise files, you can follow through with this. You can follow me through as we're doing these changes and see the different steps we've taken. So I make sure everything is saved. Let's do a refresh in our browser window. And obviously we've got to go load our new file. And now you'll notice that we've got a white background for our body. It does take up about 80% of the window. And when I resize this, as I'm going to do right now, you'll notice it stays centered in that browser window based on the settings that we've given it. It maintains about 80% of the width and keeps itself centered based on that margin left and margin right auto. Kind of cool. That, by the way, is a very responsive web page, because you'll notice it responds. We call it responsive because it responds to the size of the browser window. And a lot of web designers and web developers are using responsive web pages now based on the different types of devices that are out there that we're actually writing web pages to. Okay, one thing I want to point out, notice with the CSS Reset, now that we've actually moved the body off that left edge, notice what our CSS Reset has done to our UL and OL tags. You couldn't see these before because they were so flushed up against the left edge of the browser window. Now you can actually see that the bullets and the numbering extend outside of the body of our element. So what we need to do is we need to go in and fix that, and we're going to. But that was one of the things that our CSS Reset had done. We'd taken away all the styling from those UL and OL tags. And what I'm talking about is right here. These UL and OL tags is ordered and unordered list tags. We'd taken all that styling away in that CSS Reset, so we didn't even see these because everything was flushed up against this side. Once we moved it inside the body, you could actually see that we'd lost some of that formatting, and we'll fix that in our CSS. So the next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and we're going to go back in that body element because I want to assign an overall font family to my entire page. Remember we talked about the cascading effect of styles? If I assign something in the body based on normal document flow, it's going to flow down to everything else that's inside that body element. That's what the cascading effect of cascading style sheets, that's what the cascade means. So I'm going to go ahead and put a font family in there. And I'm going to put this as part of our body element so it does cascade down. So it's inside my body element curly braces. And I'm going to use a font family of Verdana, Tahoma, and Sans Serif. Now would be a great time for you to pause if you need to type that in. I want to go ahead and save that change. Remember, none of these take effects until we save them to our documents and refresh our browser window. So let's go back into the browser window and refresh the browser window, and you're going to see a big difference now in the page itself. All the text have changed or has changed inside my browser window. We've now given a default font to this entire body element. Changing the font styles that entire page. You notice that we've got that styling now, or that font styling is now taken through our heading, our H1s through H6s, all our P tags, everything now is being styled based on the font family that we've put in. We also have a default size for that font based on the CSS. If you remember right, when we set up our CSS Reset, we went in here and we gave a default font size. I gave it a 1M font size, which is the size of an M, the width, based on the selected font. So it would be the width of an M based on this selected font. There's a lot of different Verdana to Home or sans serif, whichever font it loaded. A lot of different sizing elements that we can use. I tend to use M's a lot because it'll scale based on the display device, whether it's a phone, a handheld, an iPad, a TV monitor, computer screen. It scales based on its device. So I like using M's. We probably, for our first demonstration, should use pixels. I'm going to go back and change that to 12 pixels. I'm going to save that change. Remember, now I'm saving it in the CSS Reset itself. I'm going to refresh the browser window, and you're going to see a big change in the way that font is displayed now, because now we're at 12 pixels. 12 pixels is kind of small for a website. We tend to use that a lot for print, not so much for monitors. So let's go ahead and change it to 14. And again, refresh. A little bit better for a website, 14 pixels. So now we've got our default font set. Remember, we talked about the size being inherited from that reset. CSS Reset inherited that size from everything else. Let's go ahead and make sure our files are saved. I want to do a save base one. I'm going to save that in my _CSS file. I want to go ahead and make sure I've saved my syntax file. And let's move into some more demonstrations of some of the things that we can do now that we're learning how to style with CSS. One of the things I want to fix before we wrap up this tutorial and move on to our next tutorial in the series is I want to fix the UL and the unordered list and the ordered list that's part of this document. You'll notice they're extending past the body element. Really bad thing to do. So let's go ahead and fix those. So inside of our base_1.css file, I'm going to come down right below that body tag, and I want to put in a new selector. This is going to be UL, comma, OL. And if you remember from the presentation, this is how we have those combination selectors. We separate them with a comma. We can actually target more than one element at a time. We're actually going to target both the UL and the OL elements with this one selector. And what I want to put is I want to put in list style. So it's list -style -type. Hit my enter key. And I want to type in none. And what that's going to do, that style is going to take away these numbers and take away those bullets that we're seeing. Let's go ahead and save as. I want to save our file as base_02 or _2. I'm sorry. Save that. I want to go ahead and save the CSS syntax. I want to do a save as on that also. I want to save this as _03. Let's go ahead and save that. I also want to go up here now. Remember, whenever we change that HTML document, we've got to change what we're referencing to. So I've got to go change my CSS reference to _2.css inside that file. Save our changes. Let's save that base change that we made in the base.css file. I want to go back to my web root and load that syntax _03 document. And you'll notice now we've gotten rid of the bullet points and the numbering that were part of the UL and OL that were exceeding our body element. So those are gone now by that CSS that we've just entered. And I think the last thing I want to do, because we've done a really good combination styling with that UL OL, but let's take it one step further, because I do want to add some formatting to my head elements, my H1s through H6s. So right below the body element, I'm going to type another selector, H1, comma, H2, comma, H3, comma, H4, comma, H5, comma, and H6, open curly brace, close curly brace. So what I'm doing now is I'm targeting all my header elements, my H1s through H6s, which are what we use here. These are these bold type that we're using on our document. It's all the heading elements that we have in our current HTML document. And what I want to do is I want to add a margin to them. Because right now everything is way too close together. All my headings are smashed right up against my text, and a whole bunch of things going on in this document. Throughout the course of the tutorial, obviously, we're going to be formatting this and do some really cool things with it. But right now we're just trying to get it set up a little bit so you can get some ideas on how these different elements, selectors, declarations, and styles work inside CSS. So what I want to do is I'm going to type margin, because that's what I want to set. I want to set a margin in this for these particular elements. And I'm going to use what's called shorthand. As you can see, I can do a margin right, margin left, margin bottom, margin top. By selecting the margin, I can actually do all 4 of these at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I want to put 10 pixels on the top, and this is read like a clock. So it starts at the top, 12 o'clock, 10 pixels. I want to do 0 pixels on the right, which would be 3 o'clock. I want to do 10 pixels on the bottom, which would be 6 o'clock. And I want to do 20 pixels on the left, which would be 9 o'clock. So I'm actually doing all 4 sides of the margins around these heading elements in one line. And they call it shorthand notation in CSS. There's a lot of different things that we can do with shorthand notation, and you'll learn that as we work through all these CSS tutorial series. But right now we're just going to do our margins. I'm doing a top. Remember that's top are 12 o'clock, 0 is 3 o'clock, 10 pixels is 6 o'clock, and 20 pixels is 9 o'clock. So I've got top, right, bottom, and left. Let's go ahead and save that change. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window, and you can see now that we've actually picked up a little bit of spacing. We're actually starting to separate some things on our document. Things are starting to look a little more organized. And we're going to continue with this default file that we're using as we work through the tutorial series, so hang on to it. You're going to need it for the next tutorial. Okay, really cool. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. One other thing I want to touch base on is I want to talk to you about some sources of additional information as you're looking through the different selectors and values and properties and the stuff that's available in CSS, because there's a lot of things that are going on in CSS right now. So one thing I want to point out is the CSS Specification Home page. You'll see that link on my screen. It's the www.w3.org/style/CSS. Really great information on CSS in general. We have the CSS 2.1 specification page, and you'll see that link on your screen. An excellent place to get standards and specifications for the current version of CSS. Right now we're currently at 2.1. That's what everything is based on. That's what everybody's using. But we're moving to CSS Level 3 recommendation. There's a lot of new things that are coming out in CSS, and the CSS Level 3 recommendation is where all that information is, all the new tags and how they're looking at them and testing them and doing all this cool stuff and the proposals. But you'll see that link on your screen also. These are 3 great places to visit, to learn more and more and get deeply into CSS. Most of the information I presented in this presentation was researched on the W3C reference site, which is www.w3.org. That's where I get most of my information, not only on CSS, but also on HTML, because that is the specification body. That's where they reside. That's where everything's tested, everything's approved or disapproved, and everything either moves into a specification or is discarded and is not part of the specification. So 3 really good spots to go get additional information, and I highly recommend that you use these sources of information to build your knowledge of CSS.
I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available in the development environment. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting.